You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Hello, and welcome to Ben Franklin's World Revisited, a series of classic episodes that bring fresh perspective to our latest episodes and add deeper connections to our understanding of early American history. I'm your host, Liz Covart. In our last episode, episode 399, we discussed Denmark Vesey's revolt and the way that biblical texts and scripture enabled Vesey to organize what would have been the largest slave revolt in United States history if the revolt had not been thwarted before Vesey could put it into action. Now, early American history is filled with revolts against enslavers that were thwarted and never made it past the planning stage. But one uprising that did move beyond the planning stage and was put into action was the Southampton Rebellion, or Nat Turner's Revolt, in August 1831. In episode 133, which released in May 2017, we met with Patrick Breen, an associate professor of history at Providence College. Patrick joined us to investigate Nat Turner's Revolt with details from his book, The Land Shall Be Deluged in Blood, A New History of the Nat Turner Revolt. Given that we just explored Denmark Vesey's failed uprising, I thought it might be good for us to have a point of comparison, because like Vesey, Turner was a religious man who also justified his actions using God and scripture. So with that, let's revisit episode 133 with Patrick Breen and rediscover the details of the Southampton or Nat Turner's Rebellion. Joining us is an associate professor of history at Providence College. He's a scholar of race and slavery in the early United States and the foremost expert on Nat Turner's Rebellion. And today, he joins us to discuss that rebellion with details from his book, The Land Shall Be Deluged in Blood, A New History of the Nat Turner Revolt. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Patrick Breen.
Thanks for having me.
So Patrick, your book offers us a detailed account of Nat Turner's Rebellion. And I wonder if before we dive into those details, if you would help us get the lay of the land. Would you provide us with a broad overview of Nat Turner's revolt?
Sure. Nat Turner started a revolt that happened on the night of August 21st, 22nd, 1831. And a small group of slave rebels launched what would become the most deadly slave revolt in American history. At the peak of the revolt, the rebels numbered about 60, and they killed about 6 whites, including men, women, and children. On the afternoon of August 22nd, 1831, they encountered their first formal resistance in a series of skirmishes that took place on a farm on the way to Jerusalem, the county seat in Southampton County. They were dispersed, and for the next couple of days, the surviving rebels tried to regroup and restart the revolt, but their efforts were unsuccessful. Most of the rebels were killed or captured within a couple days, but Nat Turner himself, the instigator of the revolt and its leader, was not captured for a few months.
What do you think makes Nat Turner's revolt significant and different from other slave rebellions and revolts in early American history?
Well, there's a couple things. First, it was the most deadly slave revolt, and that's in part because it happened. Most of the revolts that we know about aren't really revolts. They're conspiracies or plots. It also is the most famous revolt in American history. There's movies made about it. There's novels. There's plays. This is one that people feel that they know a lot about. And so this is something that's very familiar. We also have great sources on the revolt. Thomas R. Gray, a white lawyer in Southampton County, Virginia, took Nat Turner's confessions down. And so this is readily accessible, something that's taught in schools. And this is one of the things that's most important to me as a historian. This revolt produced an incredible amount of very useful evidence, and it provides an opportunity to examine how power works in a slave society at a moment of incredible stress.
So what do these incredible sources tell us about Nat Turner? I mean, who was he, and why do we know the Nat Turner Revolt as the Nat Turner Revolt?
Well, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, the abolitionist and one of the first people to write about Nat Turner, says the biographies of slaves can't be individualized. There isn't enough we know about each individual. But that's not really right. With Nat Turner, we know a lot of things about him. One of the things we have is his confessions, where he tells his story about what happens in the slave revolt. We also have other sources, things that he doesn't talk about. We have evidence of his wife and children. We know what he looks like. The descriptions that the governor puts out of his appearance when they were trying to capture him after the revolt. So we know a lot of material about Nat Turner, much more than we know about a typical slave. Nat Turner was a religious man. He saw himself as someone who clearly worked in a religious vein his entire life. His Confessions does not tell a conversion story. He's not St. Augustine. He's someone who's always interested in religion. To a mind like mine, he says, restless, inquisitive, and observant of everything that was passing, it's easy to suppose that religion was the subject to which it would be directed. He's always, always interested in religion. And that's the key thing about his life. He sees himself as someone who's doing what God is commanding him to do.
When we think about early American history and slavery, we know that many slaveholders were reluctant to allow their slaves to study the Bible. I wonder if you could tell us how Turner became a religious man, given this big obstacle.
He was always seen as religious. Both his family was religious and his master's family was religious. So he was introduced to religion in his community as he was growing up. He was not living in a time where the church was being divided and the blacks were being kept out of the church. At this time in Southampton County, and this is one of the debates that they're going to have after the revolt, if this is wise, but in Southampton County, they're trying to incorporate blacks into the Christian church, thinking that Christian slaves will be good slaves. Little do they realize, of course, that Christian slaves may be very dangerous slaves too.
You noted that Turner was a really devout man. And in your book, I found it curious that at one point, Turner gained his freedom from slavery, and then he voluntarily returned to it. Were Turner's religious beliefs the reason why he returned to slavery after gaining his freedom?
Yeah, I think if there's any moment that's a pivot in his story as he tells the story of his life, it's the story of when he ran away. Like many slaves, he ran away. His father, in fact, had run away. He thought he was always seen as special. And when he describes himself in his Confessions, he sees himself as someone that the other blacks look up to. Everyone in the neighborhood trusted what he calls his superior judgment. They all trusted him. He was a smart guy. He could read. They all thought that he was the one. He ran away, and that was not very surprising. Many people run away, but then he came back. And that was fine, too. The black community looked at him and they said, well, why are you back? We thought you made it away. Your father made it away. We thought you had made it away. And he tells them in his confession, he relates to it. He says, the reason for my return was that the Spirit had appeared to me and said that I had my wishes directed to the things of this world and not to the kingdom of heaven, and that I should return to the service of my earthly master. And then at this point, he quotes what is the most obnoxious quote from the Bible that the slaveholders invoke. For he who knoweth his master's will and doeth it not shall be beaten with many stripes, and thus I have chastened you. At this point, Nat Turner remembers that the other blacks, quote, found fault and murmured against me, saying that if they had my sense, they would not serve any master in the world. So at this point, Nat Turner, who always thinks that he's going to be the leader of the black community, now becomes, I don't think a pariah is the right word, but someone on the outside, someone who's an oddball, someone whose authority others in the community don't accept.
That's really interesting that Turner was a man on the outs, an oddball, as you say, because he does end up leading this revolt against slavery, which means he had to gain and gather followers to execute it. So would you tell us how Turner came up with the idea to lead a revolt against slavery and how he went about recruiting his army?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, when you think of him as a religious figure, the first person he recruits is a white person named Ethelred Brantley. Brantley and Turner go get baptized together. So his religion is completely not seen as a war on slavery or something like that. It isn't until later that the Spirit appears to him and says it's going to be time to start the revolt. He says Christ had laid down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, and he said, I'm going to take it on. The time was fast approaching when the first should be last and the last should be first. And at that point, Nat Turner gets the idea there's going to be a war. Yet even at that point, he doesn't tell anyone about it. It isn't until the year of the revolt, and this is a couple years before the revolt, it isn't until earlier in that year, in February, when there's an eclipse of the sun, does he finally sit down and say, the seal is loosened from my lips. And he went and told the four people in whom he had the greatest trust, his best friends, his most loyal supporters, four other slaves. He told them about his plan, and they all agreed to join.
How do you stage a rebellion with just 5 people?
This is actually one of the things that I think is one of the more clever things that Turner realized. There's two ways you have a slave revolt. Either you tell everyone about the slave revolt, and that's a great way to get a big slave revolt going. But the problem is you only need one person to betray the slave revolt. And this is why most of those slave plot and conspiracies I mentioned earlier didn't happen. These big plots are eventually discovered by whites who are told about them by blacks in the community. Nat Turner always thought that this was a danger. If he told everyone about the plan, it wouldn't happen. And according to a newspaper article that's written shortly after the revolt, it explains his reasons for not telling was that the Negroes had frequently attempted similar things, confided their purpose to several, and it always leaked out. So Turner decided, we're not going to do that. We're not going to have a big revolt. We're going to have a small conspiracy. Now, of course, this is a huge advantage in keeping the revolt a secret. Others aren't going to find out about the revolt, but it's a huge problem in terms of the actual logistics of the revolt. How are you going to make the revolt happen? And this is one of the things that the rebels struggled with. As they made their decision not to share it widely, then the question comes, how are we going to get men and material quickly to support our revolution?
We know that Turner wanted to start a revolt because he's driven by religion. What drove the other four men and the others who would come later to join Turner's plan?
It's interesting. The whites at the time emphasized the religiosity of his followers. In many ways, they sort of want to downplay their autonomy and their decisions. They're just people who are following Nat Turner blindly. And it's unclear how many of these people are religious. It's interesting that when he expands the circle, it's still only 4. Even people living on the same plantation with Nat Turner don't find out about the revolt at the same time. So it's a very, very small group. It's unclear how many of these people are religious followers. They may be all religious followers. Some may be religious followers. What's interesting is that the night the revolt is starting, there's a dinner, and it's the first time new people are brought into the revolt. And 2 new people join, and Nat Turner knows these guys. And the first guy is Jack. He's the brother-in-law of Hark, who is Turner's right-hand man. And he looks at Jack and says, Jack's just going to do whatever Hark tells him to, so he doesn't worry about it. The other guy is Will, and Will's going to become the most aggressive revolutionary. He kills more people than anyone else in this revolt. He's going to be completely committed to this. But Nat Turner doesn't trust him initially. He comes up and says, how did you come to be here? Because Nat Turner thought the revolt was small. I thought it was just 4 people. How did you come? This is one of the most amazing pieces of testimony. Will answers him and says, I'm ready to fight for my freedom. He doesn't say anything about how I'm going to follow Nat Turner or do what Nat Turner says. He says, I'm going to fight for my freedom. At which point Nat Turner basically asks him, are you ready to die? Will says, I am. Nat Turner says, that's good enough. So there are people who are going to be following Nat Turner because of his religiosity, although it isn't clear how many of them are following for that reason. But there are also people who are going to be attracted to the cause of fighting for their freedom. It's going to be young men and mostly people from the neighborhood, people who have personal connections to Nat Turner and the other slave rebels.
Tell us about the start of the rebellion. It sounds like it gets going with about 7 participants. So how did these 7 men start their revolt?
They go to the house of Nat Turner's owner, Joseph Travis, and they basically decide, well, we're going to begin here. And they hadn't even really thought about it. At first, Hark or Will, I can't remember which, one of them says, let me just bang down the door. And then say, hold on, that's not a good idea. This is the middle of the night. If everyone hears a door being banged down, maybe some whites are going to hear about it. So instead, they snuck in, grabbed some guns, and then snuck up the stairs and killed the family. Basically, they moved from plantation to plantation, quietly recruiting and killing over the course of the night. By the morning, they had gone to several plantations. They had grown to about 12 people, and they decided to start going on horseback, going faster, recruiting. They were no longer trying to be silent. They were free to fire their guns, and they were trying to sweep through Southampton County, trying to recruit faster than the whites would be able to organize against them.
This is really surprising that the revolt just kind of starts and takes place organically, because when you think of a revolt that you need to conduct as secretly as possible with only a few people, you would think that it would need to be well planned out. But it sounds like the approach to Turner's revolt was, well, we're going to start the revolt tonight and we just need to figure it out as we go.
There is that element to it. And I think they actually make some mistakes the first night. I think they lose some of their surprise. And I think part of it is because Nat Turner wants to reinforce his position of authority within the revolt. One of the things they do is the night of the revolt, he spends some time marching the soldiers. Now, I mean, what is he doing? It doesn't really make sense. It's a loss of time when they have time and the whites are all in their bed and, they can recruit blacks without any resistance. But why? I think it's partly because he's still feeling a little bit insecure about his position in the black community. I think that is also emphasized in the weapon Nat Turner picks. Nat Turner picks a sword, and he describes this sword several times, and he uses it several times, never effectively. Now, he's got his choice of any weapon he wants. Why does he pick a sword? I think it's because he wants to be the general. He wants to be the person in charge. This is his revolt, and that's something that's really important to him. So there are some elements about it that are really, they're sort of on the fly. And I think part of it also is, he sees himself as a religious figure. This revolt starts after a blue-green appearance of the sun the week before. I mean, Nat Turner thinks that God's on his side, that God is going to support this revolt. And he doesn't know exactly what God's plan is for this revolt, but he trusts in God. And so I think that there is sort of less concern about getting all the details right. Although I think, in a way, his concern about secrecy was one that ultimately is why this revolt is so famous.
I wonder if we could explore another element of this revolt for a moment. And that element would be violence. Would you tell us about the violence of this revolt and how that violence may have affected the recruitment of other participants?
This is one of the things. Whites weren't particularly concerned about the strategy of the revolt. They didn't really try to figure it out. They thought that ultimately Nat Turner was crazy, and so what they were doing didn't make sense. Nat Turner was clearly religious, but he wasn't crazy. I mean, what he was doing for reasons. And one of the things that bothered Nat Turner and the men was they saw how long the odds were against them. And so they tried to figure out ways that they could make the revolt work. They didn't really come up with a way that was likely to succeed. I mean, I think they were wide-eyed. That's why he says to Will, are you ready to die? Because they understand that this is a revolt that's going to lead to their deaths. But how could the revolt succeed? And the idea that they come with is that they think that the black slaves have to hear of the revolt and decide to join it on their own. It's the only way that they're going to get an army together quickly. Well, how are they going to do that? He thinks that by attacking women and children, he's going to somehow break the power of whiteness. The idea that whiteness protects people. This is going to shatter the illusion, the power of whiteness. And so the rebels are going to join him. And there's a couple references to this, both in Nat Turner's own confessions and in the trials of others. But the idea is, as whites are killed, blacks will become more sympathetic. And one of the things they say is that the plan to kill women and children is not a permanent part of their plan. They don't want to just kill all the women and children. What they're going to do is they're going to do that until they get enough territory. Once they establish themselves, they will stop killing women and children and any men who don't resist. So they're not really going out for blood. I mean, it's obviously a very bloody affair and it's gruesome. But the reason they're doing it, the reason they're out for blood is because they think that that's going to help them recruit black soldiers. Now, I don't think it ultimately works. They don't get many recruits from places that they don't visit. Newspapers at the time say, the only recruits that Nat Turner gets are people who actually enlisted when his army went to their plantation. That's not exactly true. There's a handful of people who do show up and join the army sort of on their own. But it's not many, and it's certainly not enough to match the whites who are going to be able to collect and assemble much, much quicker.
You raised an interesting point earlier in that Nat Turner's army is moving at a quick pace, and they're trying to be as quiet as possible. So how do whites and blacks learn that this revolt is happening?
Well, the rumor mill spreads quickly. For the first day or two, no one really knows what's going on. People hear because there are people who escape and tell other people, and the word spreads. But it's really unclear what's going on during the revolt. No one has very good information at all. And so people are finding this out in different ways. And the stories they're hearing are different. The word comes to some people that it's a British invasion. Now, what is this? Well, the War of 1812, the British were a powerful force in the Chesapeake. But one of the things that some scholars have noted is that the British were associated with abolition. So there's a way in which there's sort of an abolitionist tinge to the rumor that the British were there. But of course, the British weren't there. The rumors were wrong, but there was a slave rebel army floating around. People, they found out in a haphazard way. There's no communication. There's no Amber Alerts. There's nothing that's going to tell everyone exactly what's going on. And in fact, even if it did, no one knew exactly what was going on. So it's a position where most people are living in this sort of fog, and they're trying to figure it out. And that's a good part of the story about what happens in the immediate aftermath, is people are trying to figure out what's happening after the revolt.
How quickly did news of this revolt spread? It sounds like there were a lot of rumors, or what we call fake news today, traveling around as this revolt was taking place. But how fast did both real news and fake news spread across Virginia and the United States?
It's spreading really quickly. The news makes it to Richmond within a day or two. People are finding out about the revolt. Norfolk, which is about the same distance away to the east, is finding out within a day or two. People are finding out quickly. But what they're finding out, they don't know. It's funny. There's this newspaper in Richmond where the editor's just sitting there banging his head. We hear one thing, and then we hear another, and then we hear, the third thing contradicts both of them. He says there are reports in abundance, but where are the facts? They don't know what's going on. And this is really where most people are in the days after the revolt. Whites don't know what's going on. The blacks don't know what's going on. It's very unclear. There are rumors of, not far from the revolt, of armies appearing. A guy has a heart attack because he hears an army is about to appear in his house. It's like, no. People after the revolt will spot Nat Turner in places like Baltimore and what's now West Virginia. The information is terrible. And so people start acting on this false information.
We know how Nat Turner and his men mobilized, but how did whites mobilize to quell the rebellion?
What the whites did is they gathered in spots. They would gather and they would try to make a stronghouse. Now, after the revolt, many whites would emphasize the fact that the men were all brave and heroic. But of course, there are reports of men who were just completely shattered by this and terrified and couldn't hardly move. But nonetheless, when they gathered together, then the families would be put together under a guard. And in many cases, whites would get together and these small units would come together to start chasing down the rebel army. There's these sort of ad hoc groups. They're not even really militia because they're not formally organized. They're just men who've got guns and they're chasing down the rebels, trying to put down the rebel army. They would end up catching up to Nat Turner at James Parker's house. James Parker's house along the way to Jerusalem, not far, a couple miles outside of Jerusalem, which is the county seat in Southampton, the destination for the rebel army. And Nat Turner was there at the gate while some of his men went down to recruit on the plantation. So he's sitting there with some of the guys who were sort of under guard. There were some rebels who didn't really want to be there, and they were out at the gate with Nat Turner, while the others went down to recruit some more slaves from James Parker's place. While he's there, he gets frustrated at how long it's taking to recruit because they're not just recruiting, they're doing other stuff. So he goes down to get them. While he goes down, one of these groups of whites come in and they scatter the group that was left at the gate, and then they come down the hill to attack the group that's at the farm. When they get to the farm, Nat Turner and his men see him. One of the whites shoots prematurely. They all look up. There's the whites, and it's not a very large group of whites, much smaller than the number of slaves. And so the slaves turn and they start chasing them, and they drive them from the field. But little did they know that there was another group of whites who had happened on the gate and was waiting and basically set up an ambush. When Nat Turner's men were chasing the whites back up the drive, they were ambushed by a second group of whites. And it's from this point on that the rebellion has finally met some organized resistance and is going to be dismantled. Nat Turner's going to take the next day. He's going to be trying to get his troops together. But again, they're going to go in and they're going to attack one of these stronghouses. They think that there's this house, this plantation that's empty, but they're wrong. The master at it's a guy named Samuel Blunt, and he's bedridden, so he has to sort of stay. And so there's 5 guys who are staying with him to defend the house. When Nat Turner's men show up marching down the driveway at Samuel Blunt's, they are attacked. And from that point on, Nat Turner is going to be separated from the others, and the rebels will never be able to organize again, and the revolt will be ended.
This sounds like it was a scary, chaotic, and uncoordinated event to all who participated in it, whether they participated in Nat Turner's army or in one of the white groups trying to stop it. But what about the third group who participated, the civilians of Southampton County? What was it like for both white and black civilians in Southampton to experience this revolt?
I think most people in Southampton County were terrified. And I think that's both white and black. I mean, obviously, the whites are hearing these rumors of giant slave armies and killing everyone, and it's horrifying. And they were killing many people. So there really is a grounds for that. Blacks, on the other hand, are hearing the same stories, and many of them, I think, are going to be equally horrified. There's a story about what happens after the revolt. There's a slave who's sent by his master to communicate because the whites are in these strong houses, but they don't want to walk between them because they're always afraid that the rebels will find them and kill them. So what they do is they send a slave to send their messages, and they send this guy named Burwell, and he's going to deliver the messages, at which point there's this other guy named Artist who sits there and says, "What are you doing? You're working for the enemy. This is a slave revolt. You're a slave. What are you doing delivering messages for your master?" And so they get in a fight, and Artist finally gets up. He starts chasing Burwell. It goes from one plantation to the next, and he gets a gun, and he starts threatening them, and they're shouting, and they're fighting. And at this other plantation, there's the slaves on the plantation tell them both to stop it because they say if there's a big commotion here, it's going to bring the whites. And what are the whites going to do? Well, they don't know, but they're afraid that the whites are going to kill them.
You noted earlier that the rebellion lasted just 2 days. So how did the rebellion unravel, and how did Nat Turner get away?
It unravels because they aren't able to recruit fast enough, get enough arms to be able to stand up to the whites, who are not only gathering whites from the area, those who are brave enough to leave their strong houses and go elsewhere, but they immediately get support from neighboring counties. The militia in other counties is going to organize and say, hey, there's a slave revolt going on next door. We're going to come. There's going to be people and militias coming from North Carolina, which is a bordering state. And then eventually there's going to be troops and sailors coming in from Norfolk, although they're not going to play a big role in it because the revolt will be suppressed really before the troops get down. So there's going to be a lot of people coming from a lot of places. And within a day or two of the revolt, you're going to hear these stories about how the whites hear that there's some rebels on the loose, and so there's 5 rebels up north by Druryville, and they send, 125 people. They send a huge contingent out. They have enormous resources within 2 days. The first day, the second day, they're completely surprised. They're not ready. By the second, third, and fourth day, the whites have overwhelming military power in Southampton County. And so there's really no way that the revolt's going to be able to be sustained. I mean, the revolt, it reaches a peak of maybe 80 soldiers, and not all of them are particularly enthusiastic about the revolt, especially when they realize that they're going to be so overwhelmed by white forces.
So what did the aftermath of the revolt look like? How many people died in the revolt, and how many participants did the armed white units capture?
So the rebels kill about 6 whites, and it's hard to say exactly because different sources have different tallies, but it's just under 6 whites, and they do a pretty good job counting them. The harder question to answer is what happens in the black community. I mean, there's large vigilante armed groups traveling around. What's going to happen? And historians have tended to move the estimates on the number of people killed up into the hundreds, sometimes even around 200 people, which is Herbert Aptheker's last estimate. One of the things I find in my book is that the number's actually much, much smaller. The number of blacks killed without trials after the revolt is probably in the 30s. And this, I don't have an exact number, but you can come at it in various different ways, and you come up with the same numbers. I mean, roughly half of the rebels survived to the trials. So it's not the kind of thing where all the rebels are being killed, although clearly, 3 or so are. There's other sources that talk about what happens in the black community, including property records. Census records aren't really helpful because they come only every 10 years, so they don't show how many died in 1 year. But tax records cover slave property, and the number of slaves who disappear from Southampton is not that large. And once you count all the people who leave in the aftermath of the revolt for various reasons, including going to Liberia, it seems like the number is probably in somewhere between 30 and 40. Which is, in fact, what all the primary sources said. They don't tend to count the number of blacks who are killed in the aftermath exactly, but the numbers they come up with tend to be in the 30s or 40s. And that's really uncommon to have a number that's different from that from someone who's set foot in Southampton County.
Did anyone in Virginia question the institution of slavery either during or after this rebellion? Like, had this thought of, hey, if we ended the institution of slavery, then we wouldn't have to worry about slave revolts like this one?
Yeah, there's always going to be people questioning slavery, most notably the slaves. But this is the kind of thing that there's not going to be a lot of evidence of how blacks honestly talk about the revolt after the revolt, because the resources are put together by whites. And, there are going to be investigations into the Black community, most notably held by churches, saying, does this have the support of the Black community? And of course, the answer that they're going to be told is that no, it didn't. There's just some of the whites are going to believe it and some of the whites aren't. So there's always going to be questioning of slavery, especially among Blacks. But there's not going to be a lot of sources on that. There's also going to be whites who oppose slavery. There's a tradition of opposing slavery, an anti-slavery tradition in Southampton County. This goes back to the sort of Revolutionary age, but it even happens in 1825, 1826. There's a minister named Jonathan Langford who gets dismissed from his church for acting under the influence of Satan, basically because he refused to serve communion to the slaveholders. This is 5-6 years before the revolt. So this is something that there are whites who are clearly thinking that slavery may not be a great system. There's not a lot from them after the revolt. If Jonathan Langford thinks this proves he was right, he doesn't write it anywhere, at least not anywhere that anyone I know has found. But there's a third group that does start talking about slavery in a new way, and it's the whites who feel unsafe. There's a group of whites who are coming out and saying, slavery is a dangerous system. It's not just dangerous for the slaves. They weren't very sympathetic to the slaves in the aftermath of the revolt, but it's dangerous for the whites. It's dangerous for women. It's dangerous for children. And in many cases, these people are not going to trust the leaders in Southampton County who are immediately after the revolt or shortly after the revolt are going to try to say that this is a safe system. You can trust this system. Please don't kill any more of our slaves. They're going to sit there and say, these leaders are downplaying the danger of slavery. We know that slavery is dangerous. Look at all these dead people. And when the leaders start saying it's not really that big of an issue, one thing they do is they tell the military coming from Norfolk that they don't have to come anymore. You don't need to come, just go back. The whites in Southampton County, they send a petition all the way to Andrew Jackson saying, please override this order. We don't feel safe. Slavery, it's not that it isn't a good system or something like that. It's a dangerous system. And so there is this movement to attack slavery, not on the traditional abolitionist grounds that it's an immoral system and it treats the Blacks badly, but because it's a dangerous system and it's going to result in death to whites.
Now, what about the trials the arrested revolt participants received? It seems kind of surprising that whites allowed these rebels a trial, given that, legally speaking, these slaves were property who were not entitled to constitutional protections and rights.
Slaves do have rights, and one of the things they have a right to is a right to a trial. Now, that trial is not anything that we'd consider fair. I mean, it's obviously, the people who are going to be judging you are going to be completely unsympathetic to you. It's not a fair trial, but you do have a right to a trial. And a slave is accused and tried for slave revolt in Virginia. They get tried by a court of oyer and terminaire. This is a weird court system from England that was sort of obsolete in most cases. It wasn't a very common system. It was used for the Salem witch trials, but it certainly wasn't a normal part of the legal system. But the point of the court of oyer and terminaire, which means, literally hear and determine, was that the judges got to make the decisions. There was no jury trial. And so slaves would get a trial, but they would only be tried by slaveholding masters. They wouldn't be tried by the people. The non-slaveholders, maybe the people who are saying, this is a dangerous system. This is a really bad system, and we're really unhappy with how the Blacks are responding. We want to lash out against it. There's a trial system that's going to be created by the slave masters. Now, it's interesting. There's very, very few sources that come to us except for through white intermediaries. Almost every source that comes to us comes through a white intermediary. Nat Turner gives his confessions, but a white man is writing them down. There is a couple sources that come from Black ways, and one of the sources that comes entirely from Black sources are some WPA interviews that are done in the 1930s. Is an interview with a guy named Alan Crawford, who was born a few years after the revolt in Southampton County. And it's funny because when he talks about what happened, he says that they gave the slaves, quote, a fair trial. It's like, why is he saying that? This is obviously not a fair trial. Certainly, I wouldn't want to be tried in this system. But where did he get the sense the trials were fair? And this is where I make one of the arguments I make in the book, is that the courts wanted to stop the whites from killing slaves. After the revolt, any white who felt scared, for whatever reason, could kill Blacks, and there's no danger of ramifications. Now, actually, they could be tried for murder if you killed a slave, but there's no way anyone's going to be convicted of murdering a slave in the days and weeks after a slave revolt. The slave masters started to realize that this was a really dangerous system, that their property was at risk. And so one of the things I argue that they do is that they use these trials to protect their slaves, not to protect slaves who were involved in the revolts and they didn't want to let them off. That wasn't it. They wanted to protect the slaves from the attacks of whites who were felt free to kill them outside of the legal system. Now, part of this was just plain self-interest. If a slave was convicted and executed by the state, the slave master would get compensation. So the slaveholders were essentially getting compensated for those who were convicted. And if your slave was just killed by vigilantes, there was no compensation. And part of it was that they were just trying to protect their interests. But in so doing, one of the things they were doing was saying that the slave revolt isn't something that everyone needs to go crazy about. We don't need to go through and kill all the blacks after this revolt, because that was the danger. That was the fear the slaveholders had. And there's really nothing that they could do to stop the whites if vigilantes decided to go through and start practicing some sort of genocide.
Earlier, you noted that after Nat Turner's revolt, many were trying to make sense out of what had happened. So what do these trials reveal about how slaveholders were making sense out of the revolt? Because you also mentioned that this trial produced some of the most detailed accounts of the revolt that we have. So I have to imagine that at least some of these sources that came out of the trials were created because people were just trying to make sense of what had happened.
I think the whites are trying to use this not to process the revolt, because, the trials are completely controlled by the slaveholders, right? You have to be a slaveholder to be involved. And I've gone through, and one of the things I show is how wealthy these guys were. These are not just slaveholders. These are wealthy slaveholders. So the leaders in society are the big slaveholders, and they've decided well before the trials start, within that 2-3 day window, they decide that the revolt is not that dangerous. So this is the same group that's going to send the military back. This is a group that is going to convince the Virginia militia general, who is in Virginia, to basically issue martial law, saying that if you kill slaves anymore, we will try you, not in the civilian court where you're going to get a jury and the jury will acquit you, but we will try you in a military court. They really decide that the danger after the revolt is the danger that whites are going to kill their property. And so they're going to use the trials not so much to process what's going on. I think that, when you look at the newspaper reports and the accounts that are written in the weeks after the revolt, they've already decided what's going on. What they're going to do is they're going to try to display that to the people who aren't convinced. The slave revolt was not big. It was not dangerous. This is just an anomaly. We don't have to worry about it too much. And so what are they going to do? They're going to be discharging people without trials. There's witnesses who appear in the trials who clearly traveled with the slave rebels. They'll testify, I was on this plantation and I saw this guy do something. He'll testify in another trial, I was on this plantation, I saw this guy do something. And that guy's never going to be tried. Now, why is this? Why are they sort of taking a minimalist response to this? One reason I think that they're trying to do this is that they're trying to make it sound like the revolt is small. They end up convicting and executing 19 slaves after the revolt, which is obviously a significant number, but not even every slave who is involved with the revolt is going to be convicted. There's people who are doing things that certainly strike me as sort of surprising who then get off. Now, unfortunately, the records don't give us as good of information about the people who are let off. But we do know that not everyone accepted people who are let off. There's a report of a guy who gets let off, and then he leaves the courthouse, and this is in a neighboring county, but the whites end up shooting him. So there's not always the acceptance, but I think what the slaveholders are trying to do is they're trying to present the revolt as a very small thing that's not very dangerous. By September, they are clearly trying to protect their property. And the trials give them the opportunity to create sort of the official account that is going to make it seem like it's not that big a deal. It was only involving a few people. There are people who were forced to go along who didn't really support it. They're going to accept stuff like that. They're going to let people off. They're too young. They didn't know what they were doing. They're going to be de-emphasizing the way that this revolt has broader support. They're going to be trying to minimize the appearance of support for this revolt in the Black community.
Let's bring this story back to Nat Turner, because he escapes and evades capture for 41 days. So, Patrick, where did Nat Turner hide out, and what eventually led to his capture?
It's sort of unclear how he hid for 41 days. I suspect that he was aided by sympathizers in the Black community, but there's not enough evidence to really make me strongly confident in that. In fact, when he escaped from slavery earlier, that time before, he hid in the neighborhood, but the Blacks thought that he had escaped from Virginia. So it's possible that he just escaped and was living nearby without anyone knowing. I mean, he did live nearby. It's just a question of whether the Black community knew it or not. Historians of slavery distinguish between two kinds of running away. We call them petit and grand marronage. And this is from the Caribbean. The idea that one way of running away is you just run away into the neighborhood and you stay away. It's a chance to escape for a couple of days, maybe let tempers cool, and then return. The broader form of running away is they're going to run away to some new place, escaping slavery entirely. And my sense is that escaping from slavery is something that's overemphasized in our collective imaginations, but petit marronage, that just slipping off into the neighborhood, happened more than we imagine. And I think there's a story that comes out from the revolt that makes this clear. One of the guys who's convicted of being involved in the revolt is a guy named Bosun. Bosun is convicted of being involved in the revolt, and he's sentenced to die. There's a group of people who are sentenced to die with Bosun, and they're in jail waiting their executions. They're like, well, this is not good. So they break out of jail, and they stage a jailbreak. The amazing thing is, I mean, one of the guys ends up getting killed, but Bosun actually escapes. And so he's running away. And it's funny, when I found the story of Bosun in the archives, it's like dated 1835. I'm like, what? This is crazy. You got it misstated. That's obviously 1832. It can't possibly be 1835. But as it turns out, Bosun lived in the neighborhood of the revolt, a convicted conspirator with a death sentence over his head for 3.5 years. He's just living in the neighborhood. And not only that, he's trying to get this death sentence lifted. He goes up to the powerful white guys who are walking along. And he goes, I'm Bosun and I'm convicted. Can you arrange it so that I have this death sentence lifted? And if so, I'll turn myself in. I don't mind being shipped back to slavery. I don't particularly like not being able to communicate, being sort of stuck on the outside in petit marronage. And of course, none of the whites have the power to sort of grant him that. They can't do this. So there's nothing made of it. So he comes up with a second plan, which is, I'm going to find a white guy who's a sympathizer with me, and he's going to take me to Norfolk and sell me to Louisiana as his slave. I'm going to take a false identity and go to Norfolk, and I'll be sold. And then once I get to Louisiana, no one's ever going to know who I am, and I'm not going to be under sentence of death. They actually do this. It's an astounding plan. They go to Norfolk, and the initial sale that they had planned falls through. As a result, he's there waiting in the slave mart when someone recognizes him. You're Bosun, the guy who was the escaped slave, and he was recaptured. And there's these petitions that are sent on Bosun's behalf to the governor saying, Bosun is not involved in this. He was wrongly convicted. He's an innocent guy. But there he is. He's living for 3.5 years out on his own with the white community knowing they're under sentence of death as a slave rebel. So this is the kind of thing that I think it's not so implausible that Nat Turner was doing the same thing. Nat Turner remained in the neighborhood for several months, and then in mid-October, about 2 months after the revolt, a dog happens upon his hideout. He's got some food hidden away, and the dog smells it and comes and finds it. A couple nights later, the dog and its masters come back, and it turns out its masters are Black slaves who are hunting. And I think this is just astounding. One is Nat Turner. He calls them out. And he says, "Hey, I'm Nat Turner. Don't turn me in." And he sees them. They're like, he knows immediately these guys are going to turn him in. So he's like, okay, I'm out of here. So he started moving. And this is actually when the whites first found out about it. And it reveals, I think, in some ways, the way that Nat Turner was attuned to the idea that not everyone was going to be supporting him. But the other thing about this is, here it is, October. There's a Black guy out hunting 2 months after the rebellion. Apparently, the fear has lifted. And this is the thing. The trials have almost all happened before this point. So the story has been that the rebellion's not that big and we can get back to our lives as normal. And here we have Blacks out hunting at night. They're not living under a sort of reign of terror at this point. Somehow it's lifted. He's not afraid that some random white who's out is just going to shoot him, saying, "You must be a rebel." So there's a sense that life in Southampton is returning to what the whites see as normalcy astonishingly quickly, given how we think about it. But Nat Turner did remain in the neighborhood. He was found by the dog. The Black man who came upon him told the whites he was in the neighborhood, at which point Nat Turner is basically going from hiding place to hiding place. He gets found by a white guy and escapes, and then he's found by another white guy later and captured. at which point he's taken off to Jerusalem, where he'll be put in jail and await his trial.
Yeah. What was Nat Turner's trial like? And would you tell us about his confessions, which is the source you mentioned earlier?
Right. This is obviously a giant show trial. I mean, everyone knows, including Nat Turner, knows that he's going to get convicted. So it's really just a moment where there can be some sort of closure on the revolt. There's still some other things that have to happen. There's some free blacks will be tried in the spring. But this is a moment where, okay, there's nothing left mysterious about this revolt. Everything's understood. Everything's taken care of. There's no loose ends. So Nat Turner's trial is this big moment. A lot of people are paying attention to it. It becomes a very long trial. And one of the things that I think happens after Nat Turner is captured is that people, whites, start coming to the jail and start saying, what happened? Tell us your story. He's interviewed at first by a couple magistrates, and he talks for several hours telling them what happened. They said, oh my God, he's telling us honestly. This is a great account of everything that's happened. A guy named Thomas R. Gray gets the idea that he could publish Nat Turner's confessions. He could take them down, write them up, and put them out in a book, and he could publish them. And so over the course of the week while he's waiting his trial, Nat Turner interviews with Thomas R. Gray a couple times, and he gives him the confessions of Nat Turner, which is, an amazing document. And this is going to be something that I suspect, and I can't prove this, I suspect is going to be actually read at his trials. This is going to be part of that giant show thing. Now, one of the things about Nat Turner's confessions that really suits the whites is, one, it makes Nat Turner's the leader. So once Nat Turner's executed, we don't have to worry about that again. It also makes Nat Turner a really exceptional character. They don't really focus on what other slaves are doing and why other slaves might think Nat Turner's revolt's a good idea. They're really focusing on, Nat Turner, this sort of religious guy who doesn't have a very good plan. It's a one-off. We don't have to worry about this. And so Nat Turner's confessions becomes a big prominent part of what they're doing. It also becomes something that's going to be published in Baltimore and spread throughout the country as this is the account of the slave revolt. And this is sort of the account that everyone's going to have access to. It's the account that students read today when they read about the slave revolt in a history class. It's a really incredible document.
How accurate do you think Turner's confessions are, given that they're the confessions of an enslaved and condemned black man being written down by a white man who likely has no interest in making sure that Turner comes across well?
He doesn't like them. No, there's no doubt about that. It's interesting. For the first 100 years, this was thought to be a reliable account of Turner's testimony. Everyone just said, okay, this is what Gray wrote down when he interviewed Turner, and it's reliable. But about 50 years ago, a historian named Herbert Aptheker was responding to what would be the most famous book written on Nat Turner's revolt, William Styron's novel called The Confessions of Nat Turner. And Herbert Aptheker, who had written on this, actually, he wrote his master's thesis on Nat Turner's revolt, published his master's thesis and published it with the Confessions of Nat Turner, where he calls it the so-called Confessions. And Aptheker's skepticism of this is something that has really been at the core and one of the problems that historians looking at Nat Turner have really had to struggle with. In fact, when I began this work, I thought I was going to throw away the Confessions of Nat Turner because I thought no one systematically sort of said, this is what the Confessions say, but since we don't know that they're from Nat Turner, all we can really say is this is what Thomas R. Gray wants us to think Nat Turner said. The problem is, as I was working with this and working through this argument, I actually convinced myself the other way around. And there's many reasons to think that the confessions are, in fact, what people had long thought they were, which is a reliable account of what happened. One thing is, there are people who are writing accounts of Nat Turner's interviews. And one source says, I would write you more about what Nat Turner said, but there's a gentleman who's taking down Nat Turner's confession verbatim. Okay, this is another newspaper source, someone else who's writing about it. Thomas R. Gray says very much the same thing. He says this is an accurate account of what he's doing. Now, there's also internal evidence, and this is what ultimately convinced me, that there's really very strong differences between Turner's voice in the Confessions and Gray's voice. It's one of the problems why no one's used it systematically. Because most historians who've worked this has always said, well, I can hear Turner's voice some places. There's some things he says that just sound like him and not a white lawyer. But there's very, very strong differences between Turner and Gray. The other thing is that this is produced really, really quickly. And it's amazing how coherent Turner's view is if this is an artistic interpretation of what Turner's view should be. This is something that's written really, really quickly. I think that it's written by the time of the trial, so within that week, it's actually written down. One of the reasons I think that is because the way it's produced, there are interjections from Gray. The white lawyer will go in and say, I think this, I think that. And he puts those in parentheses, which is an incredibly great thing for historians. So we know this is what he's thinking. This is his comment. This is his question. He'll put his ideas in parentheses. But there's a footnote, and it's, why is there a footnote in this? And one of the things I realized is that he had filled up the paper while he was writing it. And then when he came back to cross-examine him, something he does later in the week, and asks him about all the details, he decides to add a footnote, which implies that this thing is written pretty much right away. So, this is something that the most likely thing is it is what it says. If it is what it says, it's a really incredible document because we don't have, except for slave narratives, which are fabulous documents, we certainly don't have this kind of rich source from the perspective of a slave. I mean, it's a really, really incredible source. And of course, it's not just any slave, it's America's most famous slave rebel. It's a really remarkable document, and one that, I read an appendix to my book really trying to argue that this is a really valuable thing that historians have really shied away from, I think, more than we need to.
Is it because of the sources that were left behind that makes Nat Turner's Rebellion an event that's worth knowing about today?
I think the sources are a really important part of it. I think that it gives us a glimpse into the world of slavery, and there's a way in which the world of slavery is far more complex and surprising than what we'd expect. And I think that one of the things that this does is it allows us to appreciate the richness of our own history. There's a way in which I think we can make slavery into sort of a cartoon, which doesn't seem as immediately applicable to our world, I think, in many cases. And I think that when we look at slavery as this really rich and dangerous and awful and crazy institution, all of a sudden there's resonances between this and our world in ways that are completely surprising. I think that there's a way in which we can understand our issues with race relations in a different light, given the backdrop of Nat Turner's Revolt.
Let's jump into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if Turner had found a way to evade capture? Would Turner's fugitive status have affected how whites viewed the revolt and slavery? And if so, how?
It's interesting because, of course, Nat Turner did escape for so long. It was one of those things for 2 months he's sitting there on the loose. And I think there's a way in which Southampton itself did grow satisfied that they knew what was going on in the revolt and didn't need Nat Turner as much as maybe the rest of the state did. Nat Turner becomes the symbol of the revolt to the rest of the nation. And so, the idea that they don't have Nat Turner is one of the things that's going to be making people in Richmond very, very worried. And then after the revolt, there's a movement to end slavery in Virginia. And it's not one guy. Thomas Jefferson's nephew, I think, introduces a resolution to enact gradual emancipation in Virginia, and it gets about 40% of the vote in the legislature. This is not an unreasonable thing. Nat Turner's escape is one of those things that really unsettles people in the South and in the North. It's a remarkable thing, however, that in Southampton itself, it doesn't seem like they're as unsettled by it.
So, Patrick, what comes next? What are you working on now that you've finished investigating Nat Turner's Rebellion?
One of the projects I'm working on right now is I'm looking at a very famous book, Democracy in America, and Alexis de Tocqueville. He's a French nobleman who comes to America and writes perhaps the most famous book on American democracy. At the end of his first volume, he writes a 100-page chapter about race and slavery and democracy. And so right now I'm working on a project where I'm really examining Alexis de Tocqueville and his relation to American race and slavery.
If we have questions about Nat Turner and his rebellion, how can we contact you?
Well, I'm at Providence College, so the easiest place to look me up is the Providence College History Department's website. I'm easily accessible with my phone, my email, it's all there. So I'm always happy to hear from anyone who's read the book or wants to know more about Nat Turner.
Patrick Breen, thank you so much for taking us through the life of Nat Turner and the slave revolt that bears his name.
Liz, it's so great to talk to you. Thank you so much for having me.
Nat Turner's revolt proved to be the bloodiest slave rebellion in American history, mostly because it happened. Unlike his predecessors, Nat Turner kept his plan to revolt to himself. And then, only as the time to execute his plan neared, did he share his plan with his 4 closest friends. Friends who vowed to join him. Turner's secrecy is what allowed his rebellion to take place. But how do you stage a rebellion with only a handful of people? The answer to this question is also the answer to why Nat Turner's revolt was the bloodiest slave rebellion in North American history. To recruit an army, Turner and his compatriots turned to violence. The rebels perpetrated their revolt by sneaking from plantation to plantation and then killing all the whites they found, including women and children. By killing every white person in sight, Turner and his fellow rebels hoped to dispel the myth among black people that white people held some kind of special power simply because they were white. By showing that no white person was immune from the violence of the revolt, the rebels hoped to create a sense of freedom within their fellow slaves that would invite them to join their cause. Now, as Patrick revealed, Turner's rebellion lasted for 2 days, and given that this was the most successful slave revolt to date, the people of Southampton County conducted trials for the rebellion's participants. And it's fortunate for us that they did, because these trials created a rich documentary record of the revolt that includes testimony from several slaves, including Nat Turner. Now, all of these sources come to us through white hands and white voices, so we need to question their accuracy. But although we must always question the historical sources we have, the sources about Nat Turner's revolt are worth reading and interrogating, because collectively, this evidence shows us that the world of African slavery was more complex and surprising than we'd ever expected it to be. You can find more information about Patrick, his book, The Land Shall Be Deluged in Blood, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/133. How are you enjoying the Ben Franklin's World Revisited series? Is there something more that you'd like me to do with these older episodes that would make them even more enjoyable and useful for you? Please let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.